Hello, my name is PCspacegoon, and today I'm here to help you understand just what the heck you're looking at when you bring up a unit stat card. In the absolute broadest terms, a unit with big numbers will be better than a unit with small numbers, when you're not factoring in things like magic or abilities. But I imagine you came here for more than just green line go up memes. So here we're going to be digging deeper into those numbers so you can make better choices when utilizing your units. Also, for the sake of clarity before we get going, when I refer to an entity or entities, I mean the smallest thing or things in a unit that can take damage. Sometimes, this will be one dude in a unit of many. Other times, it'll be just one dude standing out on his own. Or in the most confusing case, it'll be a war machine or war beast entity with multiple dudes hanging off of it. But, because they suffer the fate of the war beast hit point-wise, they are all still considered to be one entity. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's start by looking at these pink horrors of Tzeentch. At the top, we have the unit name. Self-explanatory, don't read too much into it. After that, you have the type of unit it is, broadly stated. Pink horrors are missile infantry, while if we look at a burning chariot, it is considered to be a flying missile chariot. Sometimes, though, it gets needlessly complicated, as demonettes of Slaanesh are called melee infantry, while on the other hand, plague bearers of Nurgle are classified as sword infantry. It is true, one uses a sword, and the other prefers to slap people to death, but this distinction does not specifically change anything about the way they deal damage in a practical sense. So, while this is good at a glance, don't overthink it. The next section is just a brief overview of some of the things Creative Assembly thinks you might want to know about a unit. Some are direct references to abilities or damage types, while others are general hand waves towards how one might interact with a unit. Like here, it tells you the pink horrors have a barrier, that they don't totally suck in melee, and they have flaming attacks. There's a lot more to this unit, but this can be a good starting place. Although, I have seen this part of the card also confuse new players, as in the case of Orc Biggins. Damage Dealer is incredibly vague at best. There are units that I would say are better at this and do not have the tag attached. Also, Bigger and Ardor? What am I supposed to get from that? Even the tooltip doesn't break this down into being remotely helpful. So basically what I'm saying is your mileage may vary when it comes to this green text portion of the card. If you want to know what is really going on, we're going to need to read further down. Alright, now we finally start getting some truly useful information. This part tells you what the total hit points for the unit is. In the case of the pink horrors, it also lets you know how much barrier they have when you mouse over it, that the barrier recharges when not taking damage, and that its max is proportional to the amount of hit points remaining in the unit. Meaning, when you have less hit points, you'll have less barrier. When dealing with units that have multiple entities, in this case 80, as shown here, the hit points are evenly split between each entity. So, with 6,400 hit points in the entire unit, each individual entity has 80 hit points that needs to be depleted independently of every other entity in the unit. Once an entity's hit points reaches 0, it is removed from the unit and cannot be healed back into existence while on the battlefield, unless you have very specific spells that allow for resurrection. Also, any entity that is part of a unit with an entity count bigger than 1 will have its surviving entities healed to full at the end of combat. Barriers work differently from standard hit points, as they are a single pool that gets depleted no matter what entity in the unit takes damage, and must be fully removed before hit point damage may occur. And, as stated before, barriers will begin to regenerate on their own once the unit has not taken damage for 30 seconds. Keep in mind as well that a unit will become less and less capable of dealing damage as it loses entities, particularly if it is a ranged attacker. In the case of a single entity unit, it can keep being healed so long as its hit points have not dropped to 0, and will continue to do full damage until its hit points reach 25%. At this time, it will suffer a debuff called Wounds, causing it to deal 20% less damage and move 10% slower. Single entity units do not heal to full at the end of combat. Each unit also has what is known as a Regen Cap. It is a pool of potential hit points equal to 60% of a unit's max hit points. No matter how many heal spells you throw on a unit, it cannot heal past this amount in a single turn. This is denoted by a solid line on the hit point bar while in combat. Warhammer 2 used to have a blood drop symbol next to the hit point bar. You could mouse over to see how much remaining regen you had, but sadly this is absent in Warhammer 3 currently. Here we have another easy one. This is what Creative Assembly considers to be the unit's tier. It goes from 1 to 3, and normally the higher the tier, the higher the stats, or the more extra abilities a unit gets. This doesn't mean that low-tier units are garbage by any extent, just they tend to be weaker in raw stats, but can make up for it in things like gold value. Next up, we have entity and unit size. At a glance, you'll see a symbol that looks like a person, and 2 numbers. The size of the symbol lets you know if the unit is considered to be infantry or large. This is important when figuring out if it will take bonus damage from an enemy unit with anti-infantry or anti-large weapon types. We will learn about these modifiers later though. Next to the symbol, we have our 2 numbers. First one tells you how many entities are currently alive in the unit. The second, how many entities are possible when the unit is at full strength. The last thing you can find here is what the mass of the entities in the unit are. The higher the number, the easier it is for an entity to push others around on the battlefield. Meaning, if you are huge, you can run into a group of smaller enemies, beat them up, and when you no longer want to be there, you can just walk away. It also affects how many people you can send flying when you charge, and is a factor in a type of super confusing damage known as collision impact damage. This is separate from a unit's charge bonus, and comes into play if the unit charging is a size category larger than the unit that is being charged. In broad terms, without listing every unit in the game, infantry are small, horse cavalry are medium, monsters and monstrous cavalry are large, and the biggest stuff, like mammoths, greater demons, etc., are very large. Collision impact damage is dealt instantly once entities in a charge, meaning you clicked on the enemy and your unit commenced the charge animation, physically contact each other, and is a max of 70 damage per instance of entity-on-entity contact. This damage is also 70% armor piercing, and the math for figuring all this out goes as follows. Entity 1 speed plus Entity 2 speed times Entity 1 mass divided by Entity 2 mass. This will give you your collision power. Your collision power is then to the power of the normalizer, which is 0.8, times the collision damage modifier, which is 0.6. To help aid in understanding, let's do a quick practical exercise using these Seekers of Slaanesh versus these Pink Horrors of Tzeentch. So the first thing we need to do is add the speeds together. So the Seekers of Slaanesh are going at speed 100, and the Pink Horrors are going at speed 0, because they are not moving. So 100 plus 0 equals 100. Now, we need to divide the masses. So the mass of the Seekers is 750, while the mass of the Pink Horrors is 100. So with these divided, that gives us 7.5. Now that we have these 2 numbers, we need to multiply them. So 100 times 7.5 gives us 750. This will be our collision power. Taking that 750, we will then put it to the power of 0.8, which is our collision normalizer. This will give us 199.54. We then multiply this by 0.6, which is our collision damage modifier. This gives us an end number of 119.72. All said and done, this number is over 70, so then it is rounded down to 70. Alright, for anyone that has not fallen asleep by this point, if that all seems complicated, that's because it is. I, personally, do not ever expect you to do this math, but I wanted to lay it out there so that you could have the knowledge. In a practical sense, the only thing you really need to know is that if you are big and fast, you will do instant damage to smaller units when you charge them. Easy. Okay.
Okay.
The next number is way simpler. And we'll give you some time for your brain to cool down. This is the unit's upkeep. It lets you know how much gold the unit will cost every turn it is in your army. This number is replaced by kills while on the battlefield. It will show you how many kills and how much damage your unit has dealt that battle. Yep, that's it. Looking slightly further to the right, we have unit Veterancy, denoted by XP and chevrons. The ranks go from 0 to 9, and if you mouse over it, you will see what permanent bonuses the unit is gaining. You will also see how much XP it is to the next rank. XP is gained separately on every unit and is gained through killing enemies. Hey, look at that. We've reached the stats portion of the card. As you might have guessed, some of this stuff will need to get broken down into more math. But other stats are very straightforward, and in those cases, I will still try to give you guys some useful information about it. First off, we have Armour. So let's take a look at a unit that, as the kids might say, is a bit chonky in that regard. In this case, Chaos Warriors of Khorne. So unlike what you might think, Armour is actually a die roll that occurs whenever a unit takes non-armor piercing damage. Each armor point is the equivalent of 0.5% through 1% in damage reduction. This means our Chaos Warriors with 100 armor, when attacked by non-armor piercing weapons or magic, will get somewhere between 50% to 100% protection from incoming damage. As you may have already surmised, the average damage reduction that we are likely to see in this scenario is 75%. Here is a chart to help illustrate the different values. As you can see, there is no point in having over 200 armor, as you will always be rolling at a minimum 100%. Things to keep in mind though, are even if you roll and get 100% reduction, you will still take 1 point of damage no matter what. And any attacks labeled as armor piercing will always do full damage, as if your armor didn't exist. Now let's take a look at the leadership stat. In Totalwar, in almost all cases, you do not need to rip a unit down to 0 hit points to make it useless. If you can force them to run away, it can be just as good. That is what this stat is all about. The higher the number, the better, as you may have guessed. And unlike other stats, leadership will fluctuate sometimes massively as the fight progresses, depending on numerous factors, both positive and negative. You can see what factors are affecting your unit currently by mousing over the leadership stat while in combat. A few common ones that will force your leadership to go down, though, are if a unit has lost a large amount of hit points over a short period, if it has sustained damage over an extended period, if it is losing in combat, if it's getting flanked, or a leader has died. While on the flip side, winning in combat, having allies nearby, having a leader nearby, being on the high ground, or charging will force your leadership to climb. To get a little bit more specific about the numbers though, if a unit has been beaten down to between 16 and 1 leadership point remaining, it will start wavering for 16 seconds, even if it climbs above 16 leadership during that time. If a unit hits 0 leadership, or into the negatives, it will have 2.5 seconds to recover before it starts to rout. Or in the case of demons and undead, because they do not run, they will have 2.5 seconds to recover before massive hit point damage is applied to the unit. The one exception to the system is when a unit takes 25% of its hit points and reaches 0 leadership in the same 4 seconds. At this time, the unit will run away or start to take damage, completely skipping the wavering grace period for recovery. If a unit does rout though, all is not lost, as it can rally and get back into the fight, provided it manages to stay out of combat long enough. Although, when a unit breaks and routs 3 times, it will shatter and continue running until it is off the battlefield, no matter what you do. At a glance, any unit that starts with 50 or less leadership is likely to run away at some point during a fight, while anything with 80 and above should do a good to great job of holding the line even under duress. There are some units as well that are what is known as unbreakable. They will always fight to the last entity, making them great for those jobs where a lot of shock to their leadership is likely to happen. Next up, we have speed. Thankfully, this is an easy stat to understand. The number shows how fast a unit can move if it is unaffected by terrain. Hills, trees, water, and so forth. And the higher it is, the faster the unit moves on the battlefield. It is also used in the aforementioned impact collision damage calculation, if you care to go through all that. In general, anything under 30 speed is pretty slow, and will not be winning any track and field trophies. Most infantry fall between 30 and 40 speed. Cavalry tends to float around 60 through 80 speed. But there are a few units, normally flyers and light cavalry, that tend to go upwards of 90 to 100 speed. These are considered to be very fast. We are going to save a little time here and cover both melee attack and defense at once, seeing as they directly interact. Although it may be a fun exercise to try and explain one without mentioning the other, it would certainly be a lot less helpful, I feel. Alright, so here's the meat and potatoes. Every entity has a base chance to hit of 35%, no matter what. You are then going to add the unit's melee attack to that 35, and then subtract whatever the enemy's melee defense happens to be. This will give you your actual percentage chance to hit. For the sake of a practical example, let's say our pink horror nerds are trying to melee the Giga Chads that are the Chaos Warriors of Khorne. The math will look like this. 35% base plus the 22 melee attack equals 57. We will then subtract the 40 melee defense from this number, giving us an end number of 17. So there you have it. The Pink Horrors have a 17% chance to hit the Warriors of Khorne in melee. Doesn't look so good. Probably going to want to pull them back and use their ranged attacks instead, if possible. Something else to take note of as well is that you can never have lower than an 8% chance to hit, or higher than a 90% chance to hit, even if you are rocking some very swell numbers. Next on the unit card, we have weapon strength. A unit's weapon strength tells you how much raw damage will be applied to an entity when an attack strikes home. If you have a unit with 120 entities and the weapon strength is 28, that means each individual entity does 28 damage per attack. The number displayed is not the entire unit's damage added together. It is basically impossible for an entire unit of melee infantry to be able to hit the same target due to surface area, so adding all of their damage together doesn't make any practical sense. Units with a smaller entity size tend to have higher weapon strength, to make up for having fewer weapons to swing. They also deal out a type of damage known as splash damage, so they can hit multiple enemy entities at once. This is so they are not just one-punch manning each individual infantry entity into another dimension every attack. But more on that in a moment. All weapon strength is split between base weapon damage and armor-piercing weapon damage, as you can see by mousing over the weapon strength on the stats card. As you may have already guessed, seeing as we talked about armor, base weapon damage is reduced by the armor die roll, and armor-piercing damage is not. Armor-piercing damage can be reduced by certain resistances, but we will talk about those later in the video. For now though, let's address splash damage and how it works. A splash attack's zone shape is variable, and is determined by the unit's attack animations. Splash damage is the entity's weapon strength split across all entities being splashed, meaning an entity with 100 damage splashing 4 targets will have its damage split to 25, 25, 25, 25, respectively. If you have a situation, though, with a splash attacker dealing damage to a single entity unit, some but not all monsters, like Chaos Spawn, Trolls, Gorgers, and Dragon Ogres, or Chariots, within a group of smaller entities, these high precedence entities will take all the damage, instead of allowing attacks to splash like normal across multiple smaller entities. Every entity within the splash zone will also get their own individual armor and melee defense rolls. Splash attacks also have a max target size based on the size of the entity performing the attack. Remember those entity sizes we talked about before when dealing with collision impact damage? Well, they come into play again here, as most entities will only splash attack entities of the same size category or smaller. This is not a hard and fast rule though, as there are some exceptions for balancing. Just know it happens if you ever notice something that doesn't make sense damage-wise. Now that we should understand entity size, melee attack, and weapon strength, I'm going to quickly cover anti-large and anti-infantry. When you are looking at a unit's weapon strength, sometimes there will be a little symbol with a sword, and either the large or small entity size representation. This tells you if the unit has either the anti-large or anti-infantry modifier. Furthermore, if you mouse over the weapon strength, it'll tell you how much of a modifier you are receiving. What does that mean, though? Let's say, for example, you have a unit with a 12 bonus modifier versus large or infantry. It doesn't matter, the math is the same for either. The only thing that matters is that you have the correct target. Also, for the sake of simple math, let's say that the whole unit has 75 base damage and 25 armor-piercing damage. Whenever an entity in the unit with the modifier attacks an enemy of the specified entity size, it will receive a flat plus 12 to melee attack, and a damage bonus of 12 split proportionally to its base damage and armor-piercing damage. So in this case, 75% of its damage is base damage, meaning it will receive a plus 9 in that category. And with 25% of its damage being armor-piercing, it'll gain plus 3 in that regard. Meaning, each attack will be delivered at 84 base damage and 28 armor-piercing damage, all said and done. Time to get into charge bonus. As I said before, way earlier in the video, charge bonus is a separate thing from collision impact damage, so don't get them confused with each other. Charge bonus is identical to anti-large or anti-infantry math-wise, only how you receive this bonus is different. When you click on an enemy unit to attack, your unit, provided they are the correct distance away, will go into a charge animation and pick up speed. Once they connect with the enemy, the charge bonus will be applied. Like I said before, the math is the same here as it is with anti-large and anti-infantry. But for the sake of being thorough, we will look at it again. Let's say we have a unit that has, 12 charge bonus, 75 base damage, and 25 armor-piercing damage. If they successfully charge an enemy unit, they will gain plus 12 melee attack, plus 9 base damage, and plus 3 armor-piercing damage. The big difference here, though, is this bonus will fade over the next 15 seconds, meaning if you have a unit with a high charge bonus, you want to disengage after about 6 to 8 seconds and charge again, because by roughly 10 seconds, the bonus will have faded so much it'll be almost a non-factor. Something else worth noting is that the timer starts once the first entity makes contact, not when the first attack happens. So if you have an entity with a slow attack animation, they will never receive their full charge bonus. Also, you need to be careful when charging the front of an enemy unit while it is stationary, because after not moving for roughly 2 seconds, they will become what is known as braced, giving them up to 4 times extra mass, depending on the depth of their formation. On top of this, some units have what is known as charge defense versus large, expert charge defense, or charge reflection. This means, when a unit is in this braced state, not only do they have extra mass, but if you charge them from the front, you will be at best losing all of your charge bonus, and at worst, as in the case with charge reflection, you will lose all of your charge bonus, and the unit being charged will instead gain a double damage bonus against your charging units for the next 7 seconds. All of this will still happen as well, even if visually you end up knocking enemy entities everywhere. So always make sure you know what you are charging. Hit them in the flanks, from behind, or while they are on the move. But of course, there has to be exceptions to what I just said, when it comes to both collision impact damage and charge bonus. And that comes in the form of any unit classified as a chariot or certain very large-scale entities. These types of units get a super special kind of charge attack known as a collision attack. What this does is it overrides the collision impact damage for the first 3 through 4 entities impacted. Instead, they deal instant attacks and damage during entity-on-entity contact, using the charging unit's melee attack and weapon strength modified by the charge bonus. The entities being charged still get their melee defense and armor defense rolls when being subjected to this kind of attack. If the charging unit's entities impact more than their allotted 3 to 4 enemy entities, they will go back to using collision impact damage for the remainder of the charge. The charge bonus is applied or removed the same as normal during and after the initial collision. As you may have guessed, this can result in some fairly ludicrous damage. Alright, all that clear as mud? Excellent. And we're walking. Only 3 more stats to go, and all 3 of these are for ranged units only. Starting off, we have ammunition. Thankfully, after all of that other stuff, this one is easy. The number tells you how many times each ranged entity in a unit can use a ranged attack before they need to draw their poker of choice and run into melee. Simple as that. The range stat lets you know how far a missile unit can shoot at a maximum. Be aware though, even if the game is telling you you can shoot a certain distance, your unit will still lose accuracy at the outer edge of its range. Each unit has what is known as a calibration distance. This is the range at which a unit's accuracy will be greatly improved. Unfortunately for us, this number is not displayed on the unit card. So just remember, sometimes you may want to wait to fire until the enemy is slightly closer than max range, if you're wanting more of your shots to count. On average, range for non-artillery type units is around 140 to 160. Long range is considered to be anything 180 and above. Anything with less than 100 range is normally a skirmisher or a hybrid unit, used for hit and runs or taking a few pot shots before closing the distance and engaging in melee. Alright, here we go. Last thing in the actual stat portion of the unit card is missile strength, and it works extremely similarly to the way weapon strength does for melee. In that the damage is split between base missile damage, which is reduced by armor, and armor-piercing missile damage, which is not reduced by armor. There is also base explosive damage and armor-piercing explosive damage, but I will explain that further in a moment. There are a few other notable differences I want to cover first, so let's go over those now. For example, as you may have guessed, you do not need to roll against the enemy's melee defense to deal damage. Instead, if the enemy is to block your projectile, they need to be facing you and have a shield of some type, denoted by a symbol near their armor stat. This will grant each entity in the unit the stated % chance to parry each missile attack, reducing the damage to 0, if successful. The caveat to this type of defense, though, is if the incoming projectile is large enough. Basically, anything bigger than your standard arrow or bullet will ignore the shield entirely. If you are firing on an enemy that does not have a shield, though, provided the animation of the projectile connects with an entity, it will do damage. Something else to take note of is that missile damage is displayed as the damage an entity can deal over a 10-second period of attacking, instead of in a single attack. This is why anything that increases a unit's reload speed will also spike its missile strength. But of course, this will also increase its ammo consumption. Another reason to be mindful of larger projectiles is they will likely not be stopped by a single entity, depending on how big the entity being struck and the projectile doing the striking happen to be. Meaning, a large enough single projectile can kill or injure quite a few infantry or even monsters before it slows down. Lastly, explosive damage is not split the same way splash damage is for melee. Meaning, entities in the main part of an explosion, no matter how many there are, will still all receive full damage. The only way to take less damage is to be further away from the center of the explosion when it happens. Here we have the abilities section of the card. So much stuff goes on in here, I'm not even going to attempt to name it all. But if you want to know anything outside of the raw combat stats of a unit, you will want to look here, as it will list anything that is special about the unit, including all of its spells and resistances. Speaking of resistances, though, that brings me to the final couple of things I want to address before closing out this video. And those things are resistances, weaknesses, and attack types. First off, all resistances max out at 90%, no matter how high you manage to get the number to say that it is. Weaknesses, if you somehow manage to do it, max out at negative 100%. There are 5 types of resistances in the game currently: ward save, physical resistance, missile resistance, spell resistance, and fire resistance. Ward save is a resistance against every type of attack or spell and will reduce all incoming damage by whatever % the ward save happens to be. Physical resistance will only protect you against non-magical attacks, thus making it a good defense against things like armor-piercing damage. Missile resistance will reduce all damage dealt by missile weapons, both small arms and artillery. Spell resistance will protect you from, as you may have guessed, spells. It will not protect you, though, from any units wielding standard missile or melee magical attacks. Fire resistance will reduce all damage that is tagged as a flaming attack or spell. Flaming attacks can be magical in the form of a spell, or standard attack, physical, or missile, depending on how they are delivered. As such, will be reduced by those resistances even further if applicable. Resistances are a flat percentage-based reduction to whatever type of attack they protect against. Every type of resistance stacks, as I just mentioned with flaming attacks. So, for a quick practical example, let's say you were being attacked by a physical, flaming missile attack and had a physical resist of 20%, a flame resist of 10%, a missile resist of 20%, and a ward save of 30%. As all of these resistances are additive, you will put them all together and find the incoming damage from that source will be reduced by a flat 80%. Weaknesses work exactly the same way, only in reverse. Lastly, different units can wield different types of attacks. You can see this by looking at or mousing over the symbol next to their melee attack or ammunition stat. If there is no symbol present, the attack is classified as physical. These attacks will be reduced by the appropriate resistances, but will also allow you to bypass or decrease others, as in the case of magical attacks. You will not have your damage affected at all if the enemy is only protected by physical resistance. These types of attacks and spells are still fully affected by armor, and this interaction is multiplicative. Meaning, let's say the target has a ward save of 50%, and an attack is dealing 100 damage to said target. If the armor damage reduction blocks 50 of that damage, the remaining 50 would then be reduced by the 50%, leaving 25 damage to strike the target, all said and done. And I'm just gonna say it again, one more time, standard magical attacks are not reduced by spell resistance. Hey, you made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching. I know this was a lot. I hope you learned something, though, that'll help make your Total War Warhammer experience more enjoyable. If you are interested, I have a trimmed-down text version of this video as well for you to reference. I will pin the link to that in the comments. And if you want to see more of me, please feel free to browse the channel. Subscribe here, or head over to PCspacegoon on twitch.tv to catch me live. I would love to see you. Links in the comments. Thank you ever so much again for watching. I'll see you on the battlefield.